Welcome everybody to yet another episode in our documented dialogue series here at Collective for Women Philosophers in India. Today, we have with us Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, who is a contemporary woman philosopher of repute. So let me briefly introduce her. It's very difficult to introduce her briefly, but at least for the sake of introducing her to you so that you know who our guest is today, I'm just here with a very small introduction. So Kanchana Mahadevan is a professor at the Department of Philosophy, University of Mumbai. She teaches and writes in the areas of Continental Philosophy, Feminist Philosophy, Ethics, Social and Political Philosophy, Decolonization, and Critical Theory. She has various publications to her credit, but very interestingly, and I'm mentioning only a few, her book Between Femininity and Feminism, Colonial and Post-Colonial Perspectives on Care examines the relevance of Western feminist philosophy in the Indian context. She also has a co-edited volume of philosophical and psychological essays on the pandemic entitled The COVID Spectrum, Theoretical and Experiential Perspectives. She is also the editor of University of Mumbai's Interdisciplinary Humanities Online Research Journal, which goes by the title Sambhashan. Her recent work...
I used to be, not anymore.
So she used to be, she has been the editor. Her recent work attempts to situate the care theoretical perspective in the Indian context with specific reference to nursing policies and practices. She is also working on the significance of gender in debates on the secular and the post-secular. So we welcome you, Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, for this documented dialogue series. And let me just begin with asking you a question. Just share very briefly and with us your journey as a scholar and professor of philosophy based in India.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Ali, for inviting me to participate in this very interesting series that you're doing. It is my honor and privilege to be a part of it. Well, I started out as a philosophy student, and I think I continue to remain that in some way. I was exposed to philosophy initially during my school days through European literature and Indian English poetry, particularly George Eliot's work, Mill on the Floss, Middlemarch, Alice Walker's Color Purple, Thomas Hardy's Tess of the Urbervilles, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I read these alongside Nissim Ezekeil's Night of the Scorpion, Hymns in Darkness, Later Day Psalms. He is an Indo-English poet he was based in Mumbai. He is unfortunately no more. Mulk Raj Anand's Untouchable, Ruth Pravar Jabwala's Householder. I read these together along with Franz Kafka's The Trial, Sartre's Words, as well as his trilogy, Age of Reason, Reprieve, Iron and the Soul, Albert Camus' The Plague, The Fall. So I'm just trying to convey that it was not a very systematic reading, but it was a reading that sort of moved in two directions. One was that it was a reading that took the Indian context, Indian poets, Indian writers into account. And it was also reading that focused on European novelists and so forth. And reading poets like Ezekeil and Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who wrote in English and they foregrounded Indian English, helped me to think beyond the Indian Western binary, both in language and in thought, a binary that I noticed when I read Ruth Pravar Jabwala. This, along with Indian art films by Kumar Shani, Mani Kaul, and so forth, played a role, though subconsciously, in my reading of Western thinkers who were both literary and philosophical. I was thinking with them, and many a times I was thinking against them, and I was thinking in my own context, which is the context of what was then Bombay City. My readings opened up philosophical themes such as the relationship between the personal and the public, with Simone de Beauvoir's Mandarins, for instance, the limits of metaphysical absolutes in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, the recognition of difference in Franz Kafka, the impossibility of living in a perfect world, George Elliot, and the quest for freedom and justice in a hostile world that we see in Thomas Hardy's Tess. So all of this, I believed, had a bearing in the Indian context. I did my undergraduate and postgraduate studies in the Elphinstone College in the formerly Bombay, majoring in philosophy in 1985, BA, and the MA in 1987. I did Immanuel Kant, Plato, Phenomenology and Existentialism as special papers in my MA. In 87, I went off to do my doctorate at the University of Georgia, USA, where I did courses on Kant and Continental Philosophy. I wrote my PhD dissertation, or what we call the thesis, in India on Habermas's communicative ethics.
Yeah.
I explored his discourse theory as a dialogical reconstruction of Kantian ethics and defended it against postmodern criticisms by Rorty. I was particularly struck by the way discourse theory transformed Kantian ethics into a theory of justice, just as John Rawls did. Moreover, communicative ethics also traverse the divide between the analytic and continental schools of thought. I found this very interesting. I also found Habermas's earlier work on knowledge and human interest, theory and practice, on the logic of social sciences valuable for their accounts of their thinker as someone who was engaged in a web of everyday practices, and its account of critical hermeneutics. Besides, the modernity debate also interested me. I felt that Habermas's earlier debate with Gadamer's hermeneutics, particularly the idea of keeping a critical distance from text, is very significant in contexts where there are several traditions, such as ours. So what fascinated me then about Habermas is his notion of procedural formalism, which I felt could accommodate cultural diversity, which has been an abiding interest in my work. I returned to India in '93, taught at a local college called Khalsa College. And then I joined the University of Mumbai's Department of Philosophy in 1995, where I've been since. And I've been teaching continental thought as well as feminism and political philosophy. On the research front, I have been immersed in several debates since the 90s, which also led me to take special interest in modern Indian thinkers such as Pandita Ramabai, B.R. Ambedkar, and now Sarojini Naidu. Is that too long?
No, this is fine, because this is such a rich rainbow of cross-cultural influences that have been there in the journey, in your intellectual journey, in your academic journey, that have shaped your academic journey. And since most of these intellectuals, most of these thinkers are men, and that's why maybe you at one point of time in your response said that you started thinking with them and thinking against them, and that goes straight away into the next question that I'm going to ask, is that there's this general and accepted claim that philosophy, or rather to put it more openly or more straightforward, in a more straightforward way, knowledge is male dominated. The discourse of knowledge is dominated by men. How do you perceive this claim as a woman philosopher who is based in India and who has been a professor in a university for nearly 3 decades now?
Right.
So how do you view this?
Yeah. That is a good observation that when I started out, I was reading quite a lot of male thinkers. And this whole idea of feminist philosophy, this is something that that sort of awakening happened when I heard Sela Ben-Habib for the first time. She had come to the University of Georgia, and this was around 1989, 1990 or so.
Okay.
And she had spoken about some of the issues plaguing critical theory, as well as Habermas's philosophy, some of the gender issues, and this made a very big impact on me when I heard her for the first time. And then I started reading her immediately, her critique Norm and Utopia, for example, and then I consistently followed her critiques of Habermas, her reconstructions. And then again, simultaneously reading Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser was someone who left the University of Georgia just at the time that I joined. I did not meet her till recently. But then her work has been, her work had an abiding impact on me. I followed her work throughout, right from the time I was maybe 22, 23. That was the time I was exposed to these thinkers. And Nancy Fraser again had this very big critique of Habermas, which you have written about yourself. And you have also written about the various feminist critiques of Habermas. So Nancy Fraser, as well as Ben-Habib, they taught me to view canonical thinkers as well as dominant thinkers in the Western tradition critically. They also taught me the importance of engaging with those very thinkers we criticize. So one sees many things that are wrong, let us say, with Habermas, right? For instance, the whole system world, life world division that Nancy Fraser has brought out, in Habermas, where the women are confined to the private sphere. And he sort of assumes that there is a certain a certain spontaneity to the domain of the home, for example. Now, that problem, should that make us abandon discourse ethics per se, the very idea of communicative action per se, that everything in Habermas is completely sort of mediated through patriarchy and is not worth reading at all. So we see lots of problems there, but then do we stop reading that thinker because we see those problems there? So I think they taught me to see the problem as well as read these thinkers in ways that are liberating for women, liberating, and also I went beyond them to read them in ways that are liberating from the Indian point of view, non-Western point of view, because in India, again, I think some of these thinkers have taught me the importance of public reason, the importance of engaging with diversity, and so forth. So is it possible to have communicative action and dialogue through diversity? And should we interrogate power? Should we not also interrogate power and what blocks dialogue? In fact, this part of Habermas in Knowledge and Human Interests, I deeply appreciate. What are the obstacles to dialogue? What is it that controls dialogue, prevents dialogue from happening? This is something we see in India, for instance, so much of diversity, but how much dialogue takes place between those diverse groups. Both diverse groups that are separated by caste, diverse groups that are separated by caste, and diverse groups that are separated by religion. We have dominant religious groups. Do they engage at all with the minority perspectives? What do we mean by the so-called minorities, etc.? These are things we need to sort of think with. And I think the idea of thinking about the difference between a real dialogue and an ideal dialogue, and the tension between that we see in the very early Habermas, that is also, in my opinion, very useful. And this is something I learned from Nancy Fraser and Selah Ben Habib. Now, coming to the idea of male-dominated thinkers in India, but before that, another feminist thinker who influenced me a great deal when I wrote my PhD was also Carol Gould, the possibility of doing political philosophy and taking gender as a very central part of it and engaging with it. This is something that I learned from her. Now coming to the whole issue of male-centric, the problem of male-centrism in Indian thought, right? Now, male-centrism in Indian thought, of course, it is very much there, I think, and it is something that I have noticed ever since I joined, because when I did, as I mentioned, when I completed my MA, I was not, I would not have called myself a feminist then. I was sensitive to gender issues, but then the feminist consciousness in philosophy, I did not have that then. But that is something that emerged in the course of my doing my PhD and reading some of these thinkers. So on my return to India, I had a very strong feminist consciousness. And with that, I learned about the feminist movement in India, the manner in which the feminist movement in India also spoke to the academy, because the various women's studies centers in India came up because of the feminist movement. But then I also noted how there was a dearth of philosophy studies there. Hardly anyone did philosophy in the women's studies center. So this was a cause for concern at that time. I also learned about coming back to India, about I learned further about the significance of post-colonialism, particularly rereading Edward Said's work in the Indian context, and the importance of thinking about how imperialism has led to a certain kind of philosophy that has become very dominant in India, which is a kind of an empiricism, a kind of an analytic stress, etc. I saw some of this as the outcome of an imperialist outlook in philosophy, which also tried to divide the curriculum into what was prevalent in Britain at one point, logic, metaphysics, ethics, epistemology. So these classic divisions in a way also reflected that. So post-colonialism taught me this, but then at the same time, I also engaged with the critics of post-colonialism, such as Ejaz Ahmed, who brought out the problem of abandoning thinkers, let us say, thinkers such as Marx, in the name of, they are being Orientalists. Can we just sort of get rid of them? Can we not also engage with them and read them in a nuanced way? Of course, I also felt that Ahmed's critique of Said is way too harsh, I felt at that time in the course of that debate. So that debate again impacted me a great deal. And then also the debate on secularism. In the 1990s, this had an abiding impact on me. The secularism after those events of the early 1990s, the academic journals were brimming with discussions of secularism. Is it a European term? Is it an Indian term? Does it have a distinctively Indian character, as Rajiv Bhargava puts it? Or is it, as Akhil Bilgrami says, a universal term, and so forth? And or is it that we need to get rid of this word altogether, the way Ashish Nandi or T.N. Madan have argued? So that, again, that was a debate which taught me the importance of thinking about concepts in an Indian context, and that there are no ready-made concepts, and we need to really do a great deal of thinking when we read thinkers in the Western context. We have our own set of issues with which we need to deal with. And also Professor Gokhale, he was someone who visited our department quite often in those days, and he opened up a whole lot of vistas for us in the course of his lectures, and we read his works, vistas such as Ambedkarian Buddhism, skepticism in the Indian tradition, Lokayata tradition, etc. So, and the possibility, let's say, which is a very interesting paper that he wrote, of reinterpreting the Purusharthas from the point of view of constitutional values in India. So can we have an egalitarian reinterpretation of very classic Indian terms? So throughout, reading Western thinkers in India, learning about Indian thinkers, what I realized was, one thing was, we need to look at interpretation, because the concepts, the terms that they deal with, these are not ready-made givens. They would have to be interpreted. And again, in the course of interpreting them, there was one big obstacle. And what is that obstacle? That women were not visible anywhere. Right? So where are the women in the tradition? And if one were to reinterpret these terms, they would have to be reinterpreted by taking everyone into consideration. So how do we engage with women in the course of reinterpreting these terms? This was a concern that bothered me. It was a concern that bothered me also because in the city of then Bombay, Mumbai, regardless of the name change and so forth, there have been a great departments, whether it is the affiliated colleges or whether it is the university department itself. Unlike the Western context where there are more men in the departments, there are more women doing philosophy. But despite that, there is a certain canon that remained of what it is, which was like you did your Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, or you did Shankaracharya, Madhavacharya, Ramanujacharya, and so forth. But then where are the women in all of this? Whether we look at Vedanta, whether we look at Western thought, and Greek philosophy, modern philosophy, and also where is the diversity that is India, so where is Islamic thought, where is Christian thought, this too, where is Buddhist thought again, this too would have to be negotiated, right? And this too would have to be visibilized. So the struggle was not just, was as much about, it was as much about gender as it was about including, or rather engaging, I don't want to use the word inclusion, but I want to use the word engaging with diverse religious traditions as having contributed to an idea of India, right from the 1990s. And in this, that sort of patriarchal model of philosophy that was available did not permit one to do this. But then I had the freedom to prepare the curriculum. So I prepared a paper on feminist philosophy. Later on, I had the freedom to prepare a paper on femininities, masculinities, and language. So also engaging with masculinities, and also introduce a component of feminism in papers on core papers on ethics as well as epistemology. So all of this helped a lot in first introducing the gender dimension, then looking at the problem of colonization, and then looking at the imperialist tendencies within feminism itself. That there is Western feminism that has an imperialist gaze towards the non-Western women, towards non-Western feminists as well? And is philosophical discourse necessarily only argumentative? Thinking about Bhakti saints, because at that time, in 1989, there was an issue of the Manushi magazine, which had articles on the Bhakti.
Manushi magazine.
Yeah, at that time, that one issue.
Yeah.
It is an excellent issue because it had several essays on the Bhakti tradition. So I got this copy of this journal accidentally in a bookstore, and it started making me think about, can one also think with devotional literature, and can one also think with the emotive dimension in philosophy, and not just confine philosophy to the argumentative discourse, which also took me back to the Indian English poets I read in the during my teenage years, like Nissim, Ezekeil, that there is an Indian way of doing English. This is something he always upheld. And isn't there an Indian way of doing philosophy that doesn't necessarily fit into the canonical model, and that doesn't necessarily fit into something different.
So this is becoming interesting, because you talked about you started with invisibility of women in the canon, and then you also talked about this multi-layered track that this invisibility takes. Then it becomes invisibility of traditions, then it becomes invisibility of something that you want to be a part of the canon. And if I am able to recall some examples, since that will provide the context from for our next question, that most of the recent Indian philosophers, so when they started with Western thought and Western philosophy, but after a time when they started to look anew or interpret anew or reinterpret Indian thought and Indian philosophy, they, rather than it will be a harsh word to use that they abandoned Western philosophy, but they most of them they were estranged with Western thought. So Daya Krishna is an example. Ramachandra Gandhi is an example. But quite interestingly, in your thought, in your work, we see that you are not abandoning, you are open, isn't it? You are straddling traditions, and in that straddling, you are trying to pop up something new. You are trying to bring some new argument. And that is the reason that while we find Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya in your thought, we find Spivak as well, we find Habermas as well, we find Kant as well. So can you enlighten us how this intersection of both West and East, both knowledges from East and West, without taking a very essentialist position, how it enlightens your work? How has it helped in the course of your work, publications, teaching, and other things?
Yeah, this is a tough question. It's a tough question because typically when we have to, the greatest philosophers in India, they have taught us to look for the indigenous and to think without, being sort of dominated or under the shadow of Western thought, which anyway has a long reception everywhere, right? So do we abandon it? Now, this is a similar question from the feminist point of view, right? The entire canon of philosophy has very disparaging things to say about women. Whether we think of Plato or Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, there are Kant, Immanuel Kant. I mean, so they are not exactly very flattering when it comes to women. Now, do we then stop reading them, right? Or do we stop thinking about them or reading them and try to reinvent the wheel, as it were? I think that philosophy is in in spirit, it is a kind of a debate. And it is a kind of a debate where one doesn't agree with the other, one disagrees with the other. And in disagreeing with the other, one sort of reinvents the idea.
The
you know,
discursive
so
structure has to remain intact.
Yeah. So it is from this point of view that I think that Western thought need not be abandoned. That, and one is anyway, regardless of whether one wants to or no, whether one likes it or no, one is stuck with it. It is everywhere. And this is what Gayatri Spivak says in a critique of post-colonial reason, that the minute we try to sort of keep targeting the Western thinkers, we should also realize that we are using several of their categories anyway. So we are pretty much stuck with that. So then how do we then deal with this dilemma? That is, I think, so let us abandon this idea of purism. That some concept is purely Indian, purely Western, and the myth of the origin. And I think this is where continental philosophy taught me this. And this is also in the Indian context, where several of the cultural debates and the secularism debates, etc. And that, this quest for origin, that something is originally something. So I think the point is that everything is mixed up, heterogeneous, entangled, and we are doing philosophy in an entangled context with entangled schools of thought. And this is both for feminism as well as, I think, post-colonialism. Yeah.
Okay.
So in Spivak and K.C. Bhattacharya, I've tried to look at how both of them have responded to Kant. That K.C. Bhattacharya picks up Kant as someone who helps him discover the Vedanta, and particularly the significance of the subject. Whereas in the case of Spivak, she sees in Kant the problem of racism and also patriarchy. This is something she critiques him for. So these are two very diverse ways of receiving Kant. But then does this mean then that it means that there are many ways of reading Kant? That is one. And secondly, I've also defended the idea from K.C. Bhattacharya of Swarajin ideas. Let's freely think with Kant. So it is not about trying to get an original ready-made Kant, but it is about constructing Kant as we think with him. Yeah.
Okay. So that's maybe probably what makes your work colorful and argumentative, because it is not about essentialism, but about a kind of argumentative openness. That's how you straddle these traditions. You have already given us some names of women philosophers who have greatly inspired you. You talked about Pandita Ramabai, you talked about Selwyn Habib, you talked about Nancy Fraser, you talked about Sarojini Naidu, you talked about Gayatri Spivak. Can you tell us some more women philosophers who have inspired your and influenced and maybe shaped and reshaped your career, from whom you have learned and relearned?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very important question, and I thank you for making me think about it in a systematic manner. Actually, in the Indian context, the publication of Suzy Tharu and K. Lalita's two-volume anthology of women's writing in India in the 1990s helped me a lot, helped me discover many of the Indian thinkers like Nazar Sajjad Haidar, Sarojini Naidu, Muktabai, Pandita Ramabai, and these volumes also made me think about how we need to interpret some of these figures as philosophers. So they're not already available as philosophers, but that one has to do a lot of work to make them available as philosophers. And that is why I started, for example, working with Pandita Ramabai, for example, reading a great deal from, of course, and learning a great deal from Meera Kosambi, in that process, because the problem that one faced at that time was that there were hardly any works on feminist philosophy, except for Professor Shefali Moitra's, Professor Meena Kelkar, and Professor Dipti Gangavne's works, and of course, Professor Rupreka Verma's essay. So some of these were available, but in a very systematic way. I think it still is not really available in a systematic way, which is why your valuable project on which you have embarked on this very ambitious and a very important project, I think is going to, I hope, bring about a paradigm shift in the way we think about this, So the struggle was to read them, because again, when, while reading Ambedkar, in the late 1990s, Annihilation of Caste, etc. I read Ambedkar because of John Rawls and the idea of difference principle, and Dworkin's notion of the equality principle. So what is it that Indians are saying about it, and how does caste play a role in this? This is something that interested me. Now, while reading Ambedkar, what I realized is that it was important to interpret him as a philosopher, which is something that Valerian Rodrigues has been doing, which is something that Pradeep Gokhale has been doing, because the first thing that people tell you is that he's not a philosopher, because there are some, here is someone who is engaging with John Dewey, here is someone who is engaging with Buddhism, but then the first thing is he's not a philosopher. So what is your idea of a philosopher, right? That is something one needs to rethink in a very fundamental way. So I think living in India, that is, I think, a very important lesson, that one is, and a very valuable lesson, that one has to think about the practice of philosophy and why one is engaged in that. So I think the practice of philosophy is about dialogues and dialogues amongst dialogue partners who are extremely unlikely, dialogue partners who are very different from one another, not the same. So dialogue partners are very different, ought to be very different in ideal dialogue. So in the same way, when it comes to thinking about philosophy as dialogue, it's about taking differences into account and crossing the borders. There are these borders between Western and Indian tradition, borders between canonical thinkers and feminist thinkers. These borders need to be crossed. Social science and philosophy borders, those also need to be crossed. So in the same way, border crossing is what philosophy is all about, in the course of trying to dialogue, or the struggle for dialogue. I'll use Nancy Fraser's term here, the struggle to dialogue. That is, I think, what it is about. And here again, Ambedkar, I think, teaches us to think critically about the tradition, to think critically from a social context. And isn't that what philosophy is about? So if that is what philosophy is, in a very basic way, the struggle to communicate, the struggle to dialogue, the struggle to be heard, and as well as the struggle to be critical, I think so in all these ways, these thinkers would have to be reinterpreted, because they are not available. And that is a struggle, I think, which is something you have also pointed out in your project and your work about the struggle to interpret women as philosophers.
And even to find their works, even if you know about a particular work, it becomes difficult to find it.
Yes, exactly. In the Indian context, yes. So finding the work of finding some of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's works. Just now, I'm trying to get to a couple of her books, and I think the subordination of Indian women, I'll have to just recollect a title about the plight of Indian women, or it is about the condition of Indian women. It's not the
difficult for you to get it.
Struggling to find it. I have found a copy of it in our Fort Campus Library, which is about 2 hours away from where I am. But then I can't Xerox it and I can't scan it because it is 1930s copy, late 1930s copy, and they cannot, the book will get damaged, and there are copyright laws and so forth. It is out of print. So I think these are some of the struggles to find them. As you have pointed out, it's also the struggle to interpret them, and I think that given the kind of hegemonies that prevail in the Indian philosophical world, we need to also think with thinkers who come from very diverse backgrounds, and that is an effort we need to make to do that. But women philosophers in India have deeply influenced me. Some of them I've already mentioned. Vaijayanti Belsare is another thinker I would like to add, and also Kanchana Natarajan to it. And in addition to this, of course, there are tons and tons of women in the Western tradition that we are familiar with, a whole overflowing library of Western feminist philosophers. But for some strange reason, that Western feminist philosophical literature that is available in abundance is never engaged with. So on one side, we struggle to get to some works in the Indian context, and in another context, there's tons and tons of work. So Margaret Urban Walker has pointed out how there is tons and tons of Diotima's there is this paper that she has written. I'll tell you the exact title of this paper, Diotima's Ghost, I think. So it is a 2005 paper. So at that point, Margaret Urban Walker has talked about how there is so much happening in the domain of Western feminist philosophy, so many conferences, so many, Diotima's Ghost, the name of the paper, The Uncertain Place of Feminist Philosophy in Professional Philosophy. It's a very interesting essay because she's talked about how it's a problem of plenty. There's too much going on in the specialized world of Western feminist philosophy. But the Western feminist philosophy remains a specialized world. It is not like as though it has entered the mainstream. It is not as though the mainstream has taken it seriously, or as, well, in the spirit of Sartre, let's say that the spirit of seriousness is not such a good thing. I agree with that. So let's say playing with that also, so if we want to play with those ideas, it has not played with them. So how is it that despite the availability, it remains neglected, and it is very technical. There are a set of technical issues that are dealt with, such as standpoint theory, standpoint epistemology, the possibility of rethinking objectivity in ways that avoid traditional notions of realism and anti-realism. So Sandra Harding, Helen Longino, Evelyn Fox Keller. I mean, there is a lot of work that has happened, and it will be impossible to name all of that in this short time. But why is it that, for instance, just now we are finalizing the syllabus review? So in the philosophy of science syllabus that was being made, I suggested, why don't you add feminist thought, because after all, there is a huge range of books available in feminist philosophy of science, and it is particularly important in the Indian context because of, the issues of surrogacy, because of issues of clinical trials, and it is particularly relevant, and there are these very interesting critiques there. And so I think at some point, one has to just pick those books up and start adding them to our curriculum, and
So that at
maybe
least there is a
there
beginning.
will be a certain engagement.
So that there is a beginning, so to say, to begin with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and you may have you have like it's like your journey. It begins with you just being or all of us being fed only male philosophers. Then you have a very interesting exchange with Western feminist philosophers. Then you come to Indian context, and then there is this very rich catalog of women philosophers and thinkers who have shaped it. Now, how do you think that, like, since your journey is more than 3 decades long, how do you think that women philosophers or contemporary women philosophers like you have managed to shape or enrich the evolution and progress of philosophy in India? Because it's as you mentioned, it's a work in progress. It's not something that has like that can be said that done and dusted. We are done with it. You mentioned that there's something where it is still very difficult to manage putting certain women philosophers and thinkers in curriculum, isn't it? It's you are doing a syllabus review, and how have you people, how have your works and the works of your contemporaries been taken up, or how have these works been received, and how have these works shaped the evolution and progress of philosophy in India?
I think that if we were to talk of the evolution and progress of philosophy in India, the extent to which women philosophers have been foregrounded in that evolution and progress, I think I have a very depressing picture there.
Okay.
Because there is not much, you know. In fact, as you said, one has to keep thinking. As you have pointed out, looking for texts, that is one struggle. But the other struggle is also, if you get the text, let's say I get the text by Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay or Sarojini Naidu or Pandita Ramabai, or Rokeya Sakawat Hossain, I have to interpret them. You know, I need to think of them. I need to make them speak to the philosophers. I need to make the philosophers speak to them, because they do talk to the philosophers, but the philosophers need to talk to them. So how do I set up the dialogue? You know, that is, I think, a big challenge here. But nevertheless, I think there is a distinct body of work in the Indian context of Indian feminist philosophy, written by Meena Kelkar, written by Shefali Moitra, Kanchana Natarajan, and so forth. And I think one thing one can do is, perhaps, just as we have a paper on modern Indian philosophy. Maybe Indian feminist philosophy, some such paper would perhaps, you know, the point is of how do we collect the work and archive it? It is something you are doing, you know, you are archiving. You have also got a very major project of not just archiving, but also working out the possibility of methodologically engaging with feminism, because it is not just the archiving, but it is also actively engaging with the archive, and how does it reshape our idea of philosophy. So in the Indian context, again, we need to rethink the idea of the disembodied subject. We need to rethink the idea of Purusha, for example, that is assumed in language, that is assumed to have a primacy. We need to also rethink the idea of ahistoricity, as in some sense, equal to doing philosophy. So how do we do philosophy with a historical sensitivity, with embodiment, with a sensitivity to language, I think. So all of this would have to be articulated in the course of gathering the already existing small body of work, but also going further than that to create a kind of a history of Indian women philosophers as you're doing. But at the same time, in order to very explicitly be a part of that evolution and progress, also what Karen Warren, the ecofeminist, in her unconventional history of philosophy, she has written about imaginary and real dialogues between male thinkers and women thinkers. The real dialogue between Descartes and Elizabeth, or let us say, but then the imaginary dialogue between Plato and Diotima, and so forth. So the possibility of men and women thinking about the differences that their locations and their standpoint make to the subject, this would have to be talked about, and this would perhaps we need to write a Karen Warren, an unconventional history of Indian philosophy. Bringing together men and women dialoguing with one another. Let us say Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay's dialogue with Gandhi, or Pandita Ramabai's dialogue with Agarkar. So one would have to look for them or invent them, maybe. And the idea of imagination and the idea of invention is to also open up the possibility of future dialogue between men and women, because the problem of ghettoization of women is that there is a refusal to talk. And so one thing one can do is write up these imaginary or real dialogues, but also maybe engage with masculinities. So this is something I found very helpful, because whenever I taught a philosophy of feminism course, there were only women in the class. But whenever I taught, every time I taught this femininities, masculinities, and language course, there was at least 60%, 50 to 60% of men, boys in the class, and they were really interested in understanding their identity, gendered identity. So is gendered identity just for women, or isn't it also for men? And then how is it that when men understand their identities as gendered, how does that impact philosophy? And is it possible to have a kind of a dialogue between masculinities and feminism? After all, masculinity studies started off through readings of feminism, because men started problematizing their own identities because women did that before them, learning from them. So now how do we move ahead? I think this is one thing. I think so for it to be a part of that evolution in a very explicit way. So implicitly it is there, but very explicitly, how does one address this vacuum? I think this is one way out, archiving by looking at dialogues between men and women.
This is very interesting, and you beautifully began this by saying that I think philosophers need to talk to these women philosophers and thinkers, and you need to create and invent maybe debates, and that may be one of the ways in which this issue of gender gap can at least begin to be addressed, or can at least begin to be problematized within Indian academia. So before we end this very interesting conversation, and you already shared some philosophers whom you are currently busy with, like you talked about Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and you talked about Sarojini Naidu. Can you share with us some philosophers and issues that are currently on your table, that is work in progress? Can you share with us something that is going to come up from the canon of your pen?
Yeah. So I'm presently working on post-colonial feminism and the possibility of writing feminist, the possibility of engaging with feminist figures in the tradition, like Draupadi. What does that entail? So this is something I'm working on. And I argue that there is a need for a double decolonization, as it were, to do that. So Draupadi is also a hegemonic figure. That is my argument. So on one side, yes, she's been in a way neglected, but in a way not so neglected. But then there are other neglects that we need to think with. I'm also working on nursing ethics, because my work on care ethics has taken me to nursing particularly, and the kind of labor that goes into nursing practices. And this is particularly because in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of emphasis on women becoming doctors. But then what about nursing itself? There was a certain degree of stigma attached to it, because it is the labor, it's a labor that is embodied, it is a labor that is done by underprivileged women and so forth. So these are questions that I'm looking at in the course of engaging with the care practices of nursing in the Indian context and the philosophical issues they raise. And I'm also trying to look at how gender has been a neglected area in the debates on secularism in the Indian context. So what are the contributions of women and feminists to the secularism debate in colonial India, and how that would sort of contribute to an enriching idea, a constructive idea of public religion, So here Pandita Ramabai's engagement with religion, Rokaya Sakawat Hossain, Ambedkar. So these are some of the thinkers that I'm working with in this context, to think about the possibility of interventions from a more interventions from perspectives that include both faith and feminism, and that could lead to possibilities for constructively engaging with religion in the public domain. And I do see possibilities in the writings of these thinkers.
So this means that a lot is coming, and we hope to read it.
I'm still working, so I don't know. Yeah, I hope.
So we hope it comes up and we are able to read. So thank you very much, Professor Mahadevan, for taking your precious time out and agreeing to be part of this series of documented dialogues at CWPI. We hope to continue interacting with you, continue taking inspiration by the works and by the presence of influential voices such as yours in the Indian academic domain. And we wish you all the best in your academic pursuits. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, and all the best wishes to CWPI, and congratulations for envisaging this project. And I wish you all the best in taking it forward with your team. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.